another world. How could something like this have happened? Why would a young man like Dustin attack a woman in her home while she was there with her 3 young kids? Brusher hoped he could find some answers in Dustin's car, so he walked over to the white sedan. The driver's side door was unlocked, and when they opened it and looked inside, Brusher saw a pink spiral notebook in the passenger seat. He reached across the car, grabbed the notebook, opened it, and started reading, and a look of complete shock came across his face. The handwriting was sloppy, but Brusher could still make out what was written on the first page. Dustin had written out a confession saying he was going to go kill Tracy, but the attack wasn't personal. Instead, Dustin had written that he was going to murder Tracy because her ex-husband had paid him to do it. In the days following the attack, Brusher and other members of the investigative team returned to Tracy's house multiple times. They still had no information on the second attacker, and so they were desperate to find any new evidence that might point them in the direction of this second person. And when Tracy came home from the hospital, she tried to give police as many details as she could about what had happened, including trying to describe this second person, but it had been dark downstairs and dark in her bedroom, and everything had happened so fast that all she could say about the second attacker was that she thought he was maybe average height and had brown hair. That description wasn't much for police to go on, so Brusher asked Tracy about her relationship with her ex-husband. And as soon as the ex-husband came up, Tracy's entire demeanor changed. She told police about their ongoing ugly custody battle, and she said when they were married, he used to get violent with her and their son. And so after interviewing Tracy, Brusher felt like that pink notebook with the confession by Dustin was the piece of evidence that could break the entire case open, because there was direct reference to Tracy's ex-husband having set up the attempted murder, and now hearing from Tracy about this custody battle, Brusher felt like that could be the ex-husband's motive for wanting to kill Tracy. But before going after Tracy's ex-husband, who lived halfway across the country, Brusher had to make sure Dustin had really written the words in the pink notebook. So on December 18th, 5 days after the attack on Tracy, Brusher and other members of the investigative team headed to Dustin's house. They were greeted at the door and led inside by Dustin's very upset mother. The house was cold and dark. Brusher saw Dustin's father sitting in a chair, motionless and staring at the floor, and Dustin's 2 younger sisters were sitting on the couch, and it was obvious they'd been crying. Brusher apologized for bothering the family, but he said he needed their help figuring out if a note he had found was actually in Dustin's handwriting. Dustin's mother said she could help, and so she led Brusher and the others through the first floor of the house to a door that led to the basement. Then she opened that door, flipped on the light, and they began walking down a creaking staircase. And on the walk down, Brusher was thinking he had no idea what he was about to find. He wondered if Dustin had laid out plans for the attack that they would find, or if maybe Dustin had covered his walls with photos of Tracy. But when they stepped into the basement, Brusher saw that Dustin had converted it into a bedroom that any typical 20-year-old guy might have. Stacks of video games were on the floor in front of a TV, clothes were piled up in different spots, and there were a few books and video game magazines laying next to a computer. Dustin's mother looked around the room and stopped herself from crying in front of the officers. Then she crouched down and dug through a stack of papers and found a couple of pages that were filled with writing Dustin had done in high school, and she handed it to Brusher. He thanked her and then told her some of the other officers needed to check Dustin's computer to see if they could find out anything more about this home invasion, and she said she understood. And then, with just one glance at Dustin's school papers, it was obvious to Brusher that the handwriting matched the handwriting in the pink notebook, where Dustin had claimed Tracy's ex-husband had hired him to kill Tracy. So the pink notebook looked like it was going to lead right to the man behind the attack, Tracy's ex-husband, and police hoped that would then lead them to the second attacker who had gotten away. But because Tracy's ex-husband lived in Virginia, investigating him was going to take some work. So law enforcement in Iowa coordinated with local and state agencies in Virginia to conduct a thorough investigation into Tracy's ex-husband that included interviews and searches of his computer and phone data, correspondence, and financial transactions. But nothing they found showed any connection between Tracy's ex-husband and Dustin, and searches of Dustin's computer and phone records didn't reveal any connection either. So no matter how investigators looked at it, there really was no evidence other than the entry in the pink notebook that suggested Dustin and Tracy's ex-husband even knew each other. And by the time the initial investigation into Tracy's ex-husband concluded, Brusher had been on the case for over a month, and he felt like he'd already hit a dead end. Police still had no legitimate lead on the second attacker, and their hopes that Tracy's ex would prove to be the man who had arranged everything had kind of fallen apart. But despite all that, nobody, including Brusher, believed that Dustin had planned the home invasion and Tracy's attempted murder on his own. They just didn't think he had the intellect or the personality to do something like that. So they needed to find out who had gotten Dustin involved and set this attack in motion. And then, in late January of 2002, about a month after Dustin died, the investigators had a simple thought. What if they were focusing on the wrong husband? Instead of Tracy's ex, what if they needed to look more closely at the person she was currently married to, the Australian businessman, Michael Roberts? Right after the attack on Tracy, her husband Michael had been considered a suspect because when something like this happens, spouses are almost always suspects. But the discovery of the pink notebook had quickly shifted the investigation's focus to Tracy's ex-husband, and so Michael had not been a priority in late December of 2001 or in January of 2002. But now, with the investigation into Tracy's ex-husband going nowhere, investigators started digging deeper into Michael's background, and they found a lot of red flags. It turned out that Michael and Tracy had met through an online dating site when Michael was still living in Australia. And just 18 days after they had met, Tracy had flown to Australia and they had gotten married. And soon after the wedding, Michael had moved to the United States to be with Tracy, and they had moved to Early, Iowa together, where Michael set up his computer security business. And it was Michael's company and financial situation that really jumped out at Brusher. Because despite Michael's claims that he was this wealthy international businessman, investigators discovered that his computer security company was actually failing, and Michael was facing possible financial ruin. But it looked to police like Michael had a very morbid way out of his financial mess. If Tracy died, he would receive over $1 million from her life insurance policy. With this new information, Brusher contacted Michael and said he wanted Michael to come down to the sheriff's station and take a polygraph test, which is more commonly known as a lie detector test. Michael was not sure if he wanted to subject himself to that, but Brusher told him it would help police eliminate him as a suspect. So, on February 13th, 2002, 2 months after the attack on Tracy, Michael arrived at the sheriff's station. It was cold outside, but the second Michael stepped inside, he started sweating. Brusher met Michael, thanked him for coming, and then led him down a bright hallway into a small interrogation room where 2 men were waiting, a state police investigator and the polygraph examiner. The investigator got up and led Michael to a chair at a wooden table, and once Michael was seated, the polygraph examiner approached him and ran a Velcro strap across Michael's chest and then another one across his stomach. These were steps in setting up the polygraph test. And as he was getting set up, Michael continued to sweat profusely, but smiled politely at the examiner. Then the examiner wrapped a blood pressure cuff around Michael's right upper arm and connected 2 small metal finger plates to his index and ring fingers on his left hand. The examiner explained that all of these tools were used to monitor Michael's blood pressure, breathing, and sweat gland activity. Michael gave out a little laugh when the examiner brought up the sweat gland activity because Michael at this point was basically drenched in sweat. The examiner went to a separate table to monitor the test results on his computer, and then at this point the investigator sat down across from Michael. The The investigator smiled and then, in a friendly voice, reminded Michael to just answer the questions truthfully to the best of his knowledge. They checked to make sure the polygraph machine was working, and then the investigator launched into a series of questions about the night Tracy was attacked. He asked Michael about his relationship with his wife, his relationship with the dead man Dustin, and about his work and financial situation. The investigator's voice remained calm and steady throughout the questioning, but Michael struggled with some of the questions about the night of the attack, like he couldn't think straight. And as the test went on, Michael began acting more and more uncomfortable, and the sweat kept pouring down his face. Finally, the investigator smiled again and thanked Michael for his help, and the examiner walked over to Michael and removed the straps, the blood pressure cuff, and the finger plates. Then they told Michael his test was over and he was free to go, and Brusher met him outside of the room and walked him back through the sheriff's station. And as they walked through the station, it was like all of the tension that had been building up during the polygraph suddenly spilled out. Michael, who now had an angry look on his face, said to Brusher that he couldn't believe the police were wasting their time on him, that he loved his wife, and they needed to find the second attacker before anything else happened. But after Michael had stormed out to his car, the polygraph examiner began going over the results of the test. And while the examiner knew that polygraph tests could not be considered 100% accurate, there still was a very strong indication from Michael's test that he had lied multiple times when responding to questions about the night of the attack. And so for now, police considered Michael their primary suspect for being the person behind getting Dustin to try to murder Tracy. The money Michael would receive from the life insurance policy if Tracy died was a clear motive. He had a good relationship with Dustin, and he knew enough about Tracy's custody battle to try to make it look like Tracy's ex-husband was the one behind everything. Later that day, Michael got home and he was furious that the investigation had turned its sights onto him. And Tracy was just as angry. She didn't believe Michael had anything to do with the attack, and she thought the police were desperate to make up for the fact that after 2 months they still had no leads on this second attacker. And so she told Michael that she was afraid the second attacker could show up at the house anytime to try to kill her and finish the job Dustin had failed to do. But over the next few months, the police still had not made progress in finding the second person who'd gone into Tracy's house. And while Michael remained a suspect, they hadn't found any evidence that could prove he had hired Dustin to try to kill his wife. So as the police struggled to move the investigation forward, Tracy came up with a plan to try to force them to work harder and faster to find this second attacker. She decided to take her story to the public in the hope that that would put added pressure on investigators. So in October of 2002, 10 months after the attack, Tracy and Michael appeared on The Montel Williams Show, a popular daytime TV talk show that aired all across the country. On the show, Tracy told her story about the night Dustin and this other person had broken into her house and how she had fought them off and managed to kill Dustin in self-defense while her 11-year-old boy protected his little brother and sister. And then before the interview ended, Michael spoke, and he said one of the main reasons they came on the show was because the second attacker was still out there, and that attacker posed a big threat to their family and the entire community in early Iowa. And Michael urged anyone who had any information to come forward, and he pressed the authorities to keep working to find this second attacker and bring them to justice. After appearing on this show, there was a media frenzy in early Iowa. Newspapers and TV channels all wanted to talk to Tracy and their family and hear the story again for their listeners. And this is exactly what Tracy and her family had hoped for. But it didn't actually bring investigators any closer to finding the second attacker, because no one came forward with any more information. And so really, the constant media attention just started to tear both families at the center of this story apart, Tracy's family and Dustin's family. On Thanksgiving Day of 2002, almost a year after Dustin's death, his father walked through the cemetery where his son was buried. It was a cold and gray day, and Dustin's dad walked past bare trees and felt dead grass crunch beneath his feet. Then he passed a row of headstones and finally arrived at his son's grave. He sat down on the cold ground next to Dustin's headstone and he put one hand on it. Then he took a breath, reached into his pocket with the other hand, pulled out a revolver, pressed the barrel against his chest, and fired. Dustin's father died on his son's grave, and he left behind a note saying he had cried every day since his son's death. And not long after Dustin's father took his own life, people in town started to wonder if Tracy and Michael had pushed things too far by going on a national TV talk show and had driven Dustin's father to take his own life. And when the town of Early, Iowa started to turn against Tracy and Michael started fighting all the time. And the fighting got even worse in the summer of 2003 when it became clear that investigators had all but given up on finding the second attacker, and the case seemed like it was going to go cold. And so, not long after that, Michael and Tracy got divorced, and Tracy left Early, Iowa with her kids, hoping she could put everything that had happened behind her. With Tracy gone, Deputy Brusher knew the case was no longer a priority, and that even if it remained open, the case files would likely just sit in a drawer somewhere collecting dust. And for years, Brusher would be right. Fast forward to the end of 2008, 7 years after Dustin's death. Detective Trent Valletta of Iowa's Division of Criminal Investigation was sitting at his desk looking at crime scene photos of Dustin Wade lying dead in Tracy's bedroom. Part of Valletta's job was to review cold cases. Cold cases are those that remain open but likely cannot move forward without the discovery of new evidence. And the cold case involving Dustin and Tracy, which hadn't progressed in years, occupied most of Valletta's time and energy. Because when he reviewed the files, there were several things he just could not shake. He didn't understand why there was absolutely no information about the supposed puppet master behind Dustin and this other phantom second attacker, or why Michael had seemingly been dropped as a suspect without any definitive proof that he really wasn't involved. And the more Valletta studied the crime scene photos, autopsy report, interviews, and the pink spiral notebook found in Dustin's car, the more he felt like evidence had been overlooked and that the case really needed to be closely re-examined. But Valletta knew he would need to have something far more concrete than just his feelings about the case to get the resources and manpower needed to remount a full investigation. And so, in early 2009, a couple of months after Valletta had begun looking back into this case, Valletta reached out to an Iowa State Police detective who he trusted. The guy was a former Navy SEAL, an expert marksman, and was known for catching things at crime scenes that others might miss. And when this detective dug into the case files to help Valletta, something jumped out to him right away. And what he saw would give Valletta enough new information to convince his bosses to fully reopen and reinvestigate this case. And once they did that, Valletta was able to find the so-called puppet master who had planned everything on the night that Dustin Wade showed up at Tracy Robbins' house. Based on new information discovered after Valletta and the other detectives started reviewing the case, evidence found at the crime scene, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe actually happened on the night Dustin Wade died, December 13th, 2001. On the evening of December 13th, Dustin pulled his white sedan into the driveway of a home in a suburban neighborhood. He stepped out of the car, walked up to the front door, and knocked. A moment later, he heard the sound of the puppet master calling for him to come inside. And so Dustin opened the door, stepped inside, and he was immediately greeted by the puppet master who was smiling at him. Before Dustin could say anything, the puppet master asked Dustin if he wouldn't mind writing a few things down for them. Dustin said no problem, and he followed the puppet master into the kitchen and sat down at the table. And as soon as he was seated, the puppet master handed him a pink notebook along with a pen and told him to write down everything they said. And so Dustin just did as he was told. He wrote down everything the puppet master said. And when Dustin was finished, he asked the puppet master if there was any other work they needed from him. And the puppet master said yes, actually there was something they wanted to show him that was in the upstairs bedroom. And so the puppet master got up and told Dustin to follow them, and Dustin did just that. Once they got upstairs, the puppet master led Dustin into a bedroom, and while Dustin was standing near the door of the bedroom, the puppet master walked around the bed and crouched down out of Dustin's view for a second. And so Dustin just stood there waiting to see whatever it was the puppet master wanted to show him. Then suddenly, the puppet master stood up, turned around, and pointed 2 guns directly at Dustin. And before Dustin could figure out what was happening, the puppet master fired multiple shots at him. One of the bullets hit Dustin in the stomach, and he began to stumble backwards. And then when he turned to run out into the hallway, the puppet master shot him again in the arm. Dustin cried out for help, but the puppet master kept on shooting and put another round into his back, which caused Dustin to fall to the ground onto his chest. At this point, Dustin was barely breathing, and a huge pool of blood was forming all around his body. The puppet master, who by this point had stopped shooting, took a few steps forward and stood directly over Dustin. They aimed one of their guns at the back of his head and fired 4 more shots, killing Dustin.
No surprises.
Then the puppet master put the guns down, ran out of the bedroom, flew down the stairs, and rushed to the kitchen. They picked up the pink spiral notebook they had given Dustin to write in and ran to the front of the house. They threw the front door open, stepped out into the cold winter air, and walked over to the driveway where Dustin's car was parked. They opened the unlocked driver's side door, reached across, and placed the pink notebook on the seat. Then the puppet master calmly walked back inside, headed upstairs to the bedroom, and yelled for their children to get help. It would turn out there had never been a home invasion or an attack on Tracy Roberts by Dustin and some unknown second attacker.
See Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny with a free Fandango movie ticket when you spend $35 at Applebee's.
Give 'em hell, Indiana Jones!
Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny only in theaters on June 30th for limited time at participating locations. Tax and gratuity excluded. Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny rated PG-13.
In truth, the puppet master was Tracy, and she had killed Dustin in cold blood, and almost everything she had told the police was a lie. Tracy had set up the entire thing. She knew Dustin would be easy to manipulate, and so on the promise of giving him some extra work for some money he could use to buy more video games, she had lured Dustin to her house and then tricked him into writing a fake confession in that pink notebook. Then she murdered Dustin and then wrapped pantyhose around her own neck to give herself an injury, and then she tried to frame her ex-husband for hiring Dustin to kill her so she could win the custody battle for her son. And it was the former Navy SEAL who had pointed out to Valletta that the crime scene photos didn't match with Tracy's story. She said she had been attacked in the dark and was wildly firing her gun behind her, and then also shooting at a shadow of her attacker as he tried to get up off the floor. The former Navy SEAL said that it would have been impossible for someone even with his level of expertise in firearms to create the gunshot pattern found on Dustin's body while struggling and firing blind. And he told Valletta he was certain that the multiple shots to the back of Dustin's head had been made with the light on and with the shooter standing directly over Dustin with a clear view of their target. And once Valletta had that information, he was able to convince his bosses to let him reinvestigate the case. And it turned out that when he tracked Tracy Roberts down, she was living under a new name in Ohio, she was using a British passport she'd obtained with forged documents, and she was presenting herself to some people as a London socialite, and even using a fake British accent. Once Valletta met with Tracy, her story about the home invasion unraveled quickly. Valletta discovered discrepancies in different interviews she'd given to the police, to the newspapers, and on the Montel Williams show. And eventually, her second ex-husband, Michael, admitted that he had never fully believed Tracy's version of events, and that was probably why it seemed like he was lying during his polygraph test. And with Michael and others who had been close to Tracy now helping police, they were able to get enough evidence to finally arrest Tracy for Dustin's murder. Tracy would be convicted and sentenced to life in prison.
How far up are we right now? To be honest with you, heights, not for me.
right here.
Reloading. Need a drop. Need a drop. Need a drop.
Shadows traveling.
I'm out. Up and away.
Reloading. Many enemies B.
Enemy spotted.
Reloading.
mid.
Gotta go.
Sova hit 111.
Spike down B. Last player standing.
My smokes can block the enemy's line of sight. Once they're blind, we move.
Right there.
Do your thing, Jet.
Cover going out.
Right there. Dizzy's up. Blow him up, Mosh. Nice.
Enemy mid.
Last player standing.
I'm out.
Let's kill that Reyna. Our team's got soul. I want to keep it that way.
Quick feet, quick trigger.
Cover going out.
Enemy spotted mid. Wiped.
Up you go.
Be gone.
Mosh pit.
Last player standing. Last round in the half.
Spend everything. We keep nothing.
We fight to win.
Take this.
Dizzy's up top. Dizzy has
Here
targets.
we go. Be faster.
Spike planted.
The hunt begins.
Oh, my ult's ready.
Last player standing.
Joke's over! You're dead!
Switching sides. Match point.
Fight till the end.
No matter what.
The Genesis G90, the first interior.
You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music. On September 6, 1988, a middle-aged woman named Cindy Borton was washing dishes in her little house in Shenandoah, Iowa. As she did this, she heard a knock on her back door. She glanced at her watch and saw she only had a few minutes before she had to get ready for work, and so she hoped whoever was out there was not expecting a long visit. A few hours later, the Shenandoah police would arrive at Cindy's house, and they would discover a crime scene so gruesome that they had to call in a special investigative unit just to process it. This story includes graphic descriptions of violence. As such, listener discretion is advised. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer to water the 5-star review button's favorite flowers while they're going on vacation, but instead of watering them, give them no water and leave them in the blazing sun. Also, please subscribe to the Mr. Ballin podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. The state of Iowa is known as the corn capital of the world. But Iowa's 3 million residents do a lot more than produce billions of bushels of corn every year. They also personify some of the best qualities that America has to offer. Located in the Midwestern part of the country and surrounded by 2 rivers and 6 other states, the people of Iowa take pride in being friendly, considerate, law-abiding, hardworking, and just plain nice. The state is one of the safest in the country, and every year, national surveys show that Iowa residents are among the most polite Americans you will ever meet. And if there's one place in Iowa
Reyna hit
where you are
108.
guaranteed
Oh my
to be
god, that
treated,
skin is
quote,
so
Iowa
good.
nice,
Please
it's
kill
the little
her.
town in the
Oh my
southwest
god,
corner
that's
of
so
the state
hype.
called Shenandoah. At one time, Shenandoah was considered the seed and nursery capital of the entire world. They no longer hold that title, but residents of this town are still surrounded by some of the most beautiful flowers and trees on the planet, along with some of the best tasting fruits and vegetables. And back in 1988, if there was one person in Shenandoah who absolutely embodied the town's spirit of friendliness, hospitality, and local pride, it was 39-year-old Cindy Borton. If you were a visitor to Shenandoah back in the late 1980s, Cindy would be one of the first people to run right up to you to introduce herself and offer you directions or recommendations of where to go in her little town. And if you were one of Cindy's friends or neighbors, she would drop anything she was doing to help you, and it didn't matter if it was day or night. Unlike many of the town's 5,500 residents whose family had been living in the town for generations, Cindy and her husband Robert and their son John had moved to Shenandoah later in life. Cindy was born on May 22, 1949, in another small Iowa town called Garwin that was located 3.5 hours to the northeast of Shenandoah. There, she and her brother had grown up playing outside and helping their parents with daily chores. After high school, Cindy went to work at a local restaurant, which is where she met her future husband, Robert. He had grown up in another Iowa town about 30 minutes away from her. Robert was a stocky young man with horn-rimmed glasses and brown hair that he swept back from his receding hairline. And when he met Cindy, he was instantly charmed by the smiling and laughing waitress with thick dark hair and shining eyes. A year after meeting, Cindy and Robert got married, and 1 year after that, they welcomed their first and only child, a baby boy named John. Early on in their marriage, Robert enlisted in the U.S. Navy, and so he was gone a lot of the time. As a result, Cindy stepped up and became the anchor of the family, always putting the needs of her husband and her son over her own. She also began working multiple part-time jobs to supplement Robert's military income, which was just not that much. However, she only took jobs that did not interfere with her ability to spend quality time with her son, John. In 1977, after Robert left the military, the Bortons moved to a town in Illinois called Evanston. There, Robert enrolled in a private seminary so that he could fulfill his lifelong dream of becoming an ordained pastor. In 1981, Robert graduated from the seminary, and a year later, he got an offer from a little church in Shenandoah asking him to come be their pastor. Robert and Cindy were thrilled, And so after Robert accepted the offer, the little family packed up their belongings and then made the 8-hour trip west back to their home state of Iowa and into the pretty little town of Shenandoah. Once in Shenandoah, Cindy immediately threw herself into her new role as the pastor's wife. She was naturally outgoing and empathetic, and so she pretty much instantly became a favorite, not just with Robert's congregation, but with the rest of the town as well. Even though Robert had landed his dream job, it was not a high-paying job, and so like Cindy, he needed to go out and pick up some extra work to make ends meet. Robert would get a part-time job at a car dealership where he washed and cleaned cars, and Cindy, after arriving in Shenandoah, worked as many as 3 part-time jobs, including her main one at a donut shop. But despite how much Cindy and Robert were forced to work every week, they were very happy people. In fact, when most people described Cindy when she was living in Shenandoah, they would talk about her laughter. Because 1, she seemed to always be laughing and smiling, and 2, because her laughter was incredibly infectious, and anyone who heard it couldn't help but laugh themselves. But the Bortons' seemingly perfect life would go off the rails in 1987, 5 years after the Bortons had arrived in Shenandoah. That summer, Robert's church, which had been struggling financially for years, was finally forced to shut their doors, and so Robert's job was gone, and so too was his main source of income. This loss was devastating both emotionally and financially for the Borton family. By September of the following year, 1988, Robert had not had any luck finding another pastor gig in town or nearby, and the income they were making between Robert's car dealership work and Cindy's various part-time jobs was just not enough, and so the couple began talking about relocating. However, they both loved Shenandoah, it was their home, and John, who was 18 at the time, he was about to start his senior year in high school, and so they really didn't want to pull him out until he was done. And so Cindy and Robert decided that they would just stay in Shenandoah and they would weather the financial storm they were in, and then maybe after John graduated from high school, they would think about moving. But when John's senior year actually began that September, the Bortons' 18-year-old son suddenly developed a serious case of senioritis, meaning he didn't want to go to school. And on the morning of Tuesday, September 6th, just a few days into the new school year, John walked into the family kitchen and announced to his mother that he did not want to go to school ever. Cindy had to argue with John all by herself because Robert had already left that morning for work. But luckily, John eventually just gave up because he knew his mother was not going to budge. She wanted him to go to school. And so begrudgingly, John ate his breakfast, he gathered up his backpack, and he followed his mother out to her car that was parked in the driveway. On the drive to school, Cindy reminded her son that she'd be working at the donut shop that afternoon, and so he'd have to walk home. When they arrived at Shenandoah High School a few minutes later, John, who was still very annoyed with his mother for forcing him to go to school that day, he got out and he slammed the car door before mumbling a barely audible goodbye to his mother. As Cindy drove the short distance back to their house, she tried to tell herself that, John's behavior was just typical teenage behavior, and once the school year really got going, John's attitude would surely improve. Still, it was something she intended to talk to Robert about when he came home that afternoon for his lunch break. Once Cindy was back at their home, she parked the car in the driveway and walked through the back door and down the short hallway into the kitchen. After cleaning up the breakfast dishes, she caught up on a few household chores and made sure that the clothes she planned to wear to work that afternoon were clean and ready to go. Then she glanced at her watch and headed back into the kitchen to heat up some spaghetti sauce and pasta for lunch with Robert. Right at 12 p.m. that afternoon, just a half-mile away, Robert would tell his boss that he was headed home for his 1-hour-long lunch break. A few minutes later, Robert pulled his pickup truck into the driveway of his modest little house, he turned off the engine, and he walked up the steps to the front door. As he stepped into their small living room, he called out to let Cindy know that he was home. After she called back to him from the kitchen, Robert went to the first-floor bathroom to wash up before he too headed into the kitchen to join his wife. As Cindy served him a hot plate of spaghetti, Robert listened as Cindy told him about how John had not wanted to go to school that morning and how upset he was when she dropped him off. And Robert would agree with his wife that, this did seem like typical teenage behavior and that, probably as the school year wore on, his attitude would change. The pair would chat about John's behavior for the bulk of their meal, and then at about 12:45, Robert put his dishes in the sink, he thanked Cindy for his lunch, and then he told her he'd see her that afternoon after she got home from her shift at the donut shop. A few minutes after Robert had left the house to return to work, Cindy was already washing the lunch dishes when she heard a knock on the back door. She glanced at her watch and wondered who would be visiting her in the middle of the day. A little over an hour later, at around 2 p.m., Robert received a call at the car dealership where he worked. When his boss handed him the phone, Robert heard the voice of Cindy's coworker at the donut shop. Sue Rogers told him that Cindy had not shown up for work, which was unlike her since she usually arrived for her shift early. Sue had tried calling the Borton house, but no one had picked up. Robert told Sue that, maybe Cindy had taken a nap after lunch and she's just overslept. An hour later, at 3 p.m., Robert got another call from the donut shop. This time, Sue sounded worried. Cindy still had not shown up for work, and a coworker who went by the Borton house had stopped at the back door to call out for Cindy, but didn't get an answer. And they noticed that the door was open, but this coworker didn't want to go inside without being invited, and so they left. Robert called home, and when Cindy did not pick up the phone, he asked his boss if he could leave work to go check on his wife. Just after 3:30 p.m., Robert pulled up to his house, and the first thing he noticed was that Cindy's car was still in the driveway. After parking his truck just behind her car, Robert walked up to the front door and let himself in, calling out his wife's name as soon as he stepped inside. When there was no answer, Robert began walking from the living room where he came in at the front of the house toward the back of the house where the kitchen was. As he walked, he kept yelling out for Cindy, but it was silent. When Robert finally reached the kitchen and got a view of the kitchen, he came to a complete and sudden stop. Backing slowly away, Robert reached for a nearby phone on the wall and he called 911. When they picked up, he would tell police to come to his house right away because his wife had had a terrible accident. After hanging up the phone, Robert grabbed the family dog's collar off of a nearby hook, and he put it on the dog and led the dog outside to the backyard where he tied the dog up. And then Robert walked around the outside of the house to the driveway in front, where he leaned against the side of Cindy's car, and there he waited patiently for the police to arrive. When the local police and ambulance arrived at the Borton house a few minutes later, Robert stepped forward to meet them. Then he stayed outside while the police and the medical technicians entered the front door and made their way into the kitchen and back. What they saw inside was so shocking and so gruesome that the chief of police, Richard Hunt, he knew this was not a crime or a crime scene that his local police force could handle. He needed serious help from the state, and he needed that help right away. The kitchen was covered in blood, and lying on her back in the middle of the floor was Cindy Borton. She had been stabbed 29 times with various bloody weapons that were found near her body on the ground. Based on the sheer violence of the attack and the fact that the back door had been unlocked and undamaged, Chief Hunt was sure that this crime had been personal. He knew the crime statistics in Iowa. 85% of all homicides in the state were committed by people and family members who were close to the victim, which meant that right away, Cindy's husband, Robert, and her son, John, were at the top of the list of potential suspects. And so as Chief Hunt and the rest of the local police force more or less waited for the state law enforcement to arrive so they could actually begin processing the scene, Chief Hunt decided to just go outside and speak with Robert. And so he went outside, he walked down the front steps, and he made his way over to Robert, who was still near Cindy's car. And Chief Hunt would ask him, Robert, do you have any idea who could have done this to your wife?
10 seconds left.
After Robert said, no, he didn't, the police chief was shocked when Cindy's husband went on to insist that his wife's death must have been an accident. But before the chief could continue questioning Robert, they were interrupted by the arrival of the Borton family's son, John, who was walking down the road towards the family house on his way home from school. John slowed down as he approached the house and took in the sight of the police cars and an ambulance parked along the curb and the yellow crime scene tape along the perimeter of their yard. When John reached his father, Robert told him that something bad had happened to his mother and that she was dead. But as Robert reached out to put his hands on his son's shoulders, John dropped his backpack and just turned around and started running. Later, he would tell law enforcement that the news was so shocking he just couldn't handle it, and so that's why he ran. When John did return to his house almost 2 hours later, personnel from the state's Division of Criminal Investigation had finally arrived, and they were dusting for fingerprints and gathering evidence inside of the Borton house.
Spike
And
planted.
local law enforcement had fanned out around the neighborhood to ask the Borton's neighbors if they had seen anything unusual or suspicious that day. By then, Robert had also told police exactly what he had done that day, starting with him leaving the house at 6:45 a.m. to go to work, and then arriving at work at 7 a.m., and then coming home again at noon for lunch
Last
with
player
Cindy, and then
standing.
leaving again and getting back to the car dealership at 1 p.m.
Flawless.
Robert also described the calls he got from the donut shop saying that Cindy had not shown up for her 2 p.m.
out of my
shift,
way.
My
and he
power
would
does
describe
not
to
end.
police what it was
Ask
like
for
when he
aid,
arrived
and
at his
you
house
shall
at
receive.
3:30 p.m.
They
to
just
check
waste
to
their
see if
own.
Cindy was okay. After John was back
would
at the
think so.
house, he would tell police that he had been at school from the time his mother had dropped him off in the morning until school let out at 3:30, and then he had walked home. When the state investigators asked John if anything about that morning had seemed out of the ordinary, at first John said no, but then after a few seconds, he changed his answer to yes. He said that he and his mother had been arguing that morning because John didn't want to go to school that day, but he told police this was not anything serious. By the time John and Robert left the Borton property to go stay that night with friends that they knew from Robert's old church, word had spread throughout Shenandoah
Weapon
that
here.
something unspeakable had happened to one of the town's most popular residents.
Spike down.
Early the
A.
next morning on September 7th, there were police officers
enemy
waiting
remaining.
at Robert's car dealership to check on Robert's alibi. And while Robert's timesheet
mid.
confirmed the timeline Robert had given them, Robert's boss added one detail about that day that Robert had left out.
Your tactics fail.
Come here.
We do what we do. Get back to chilling.
Forward! Watch this!
When Robert arrived back at the dealership after his lunch break, he had apparently changed his clothes. When asked if that was unusual, his boss would say, not really. Robert's boss would say that on Tuesdays, the car dealership's commercial cleaning service would come by to pick up dirty uniforms and rags, and so Robert's boss thought that, maybe
My
Robert
ultimate
had
is
come to
ready.
work that day
Spike
in his
down
work clothes.
A.
He'd
Sage,
gotten
red's pretty
a
funny,
full
bro.
morning
Spike is
of
here.
work in, and then when he went home
Your
for
duty
lunch,
is not
he had
over.
changed, and then when he
You
would come
both
back,
went
maybe he had dropped off those dirty clothes from the morning
inside.
with the cleaning service.
Enemy spotted A.
While this seemed totally plausible,
One enemy
investigators
remaining.
couldn't help but think that if Robert was involved in the murder of his wife, and if there was any evidence from the murder on those work clothes, well, that evidence was now being destroyed by a commercial washing
30
machine.
seconds left.
Meanwhile,
Country's here.
investigators who had arrived at Shenandoah High School early that morning to check John's alibi also had some questions. It would turn out John's alibi was not as straightforward as he had made it seem. His teachers at his high school told police that yes, John had come to school the previous day, but he did not have any classes between 1 and 3 p.m., and no one could really verify his whereabouts at that time. And it just so happens that that was likely the time frame when his mother was killed. And later that afternoon, a neighbor would tell police that they had seen a teenager running through the Bortons' backyard around the time that Cindy would have been killed. The neighbor couldn't give police much of a description of this teenager, except to say that the teenager was a boy, and that he had a thin build, and it looked like his hair was brown, which was basically a perfect description of John. And so, 2 days after Cindy's death, detectives brought John into the police station for questioning. When pressed about the 1 to 3 p.m. gap in his alibi, John would adamantly state that he never left school grounds during that time period. He said he had been at school all day from the time his mother dropped him off until he walked home and discovered the police and ambulances in front of his house. When asked about his parents' relationship, John admitted that there was some tension there and that sometimes he heard his parents arguing, mostly about money. But John also told police that his mother and father were very committed to each other and had been quite happy in the past. And so no matter what problems they might be having, John was confident that his parents were not even close to getting divorced. He believed they would look to find a solution that kept them together. As for his own relationship with his mother, John told police that his mother had been everything to him and that it totally crushed him that his last interaction with her was that stupid fight about him not wanting to go to school. Despite Robert and John continuing to deny that they had anything to do with the murder, 48 hours into the investigation, the father and son were still the prime suspects. 3 days after Cindy's murder, on September 9th, the results of her autopsy came back. Based on the fact that the spaghetti she had eaten for lunch on the day of her murder was completely undigested, police were able to narrow the time of her death down to about 1 p.m. Meanwhile, investigators questioning teachers and students at Shenandoah High School were starting to believe that John had been telling the truth, that he really had been on school grounds on the day of the murder from 1 to 3 p.m. At Cindy's memorial service on September 13th, 6 days after her murder, investigators were waiting outside the church. Before scratching John off of their suspect list, they wanted to talk with John's best friend, Jim Bettis, to see if he could offer any additional insights into John's relationship with his mother. Jim had been a frequent visitor at the Borton household, and since Cindy's death, he had been spending a lot of time with John, comforting him. And so police were hopeful that if John was involved, maybe Jim would have picked up on it and maybe Jim would be willing to talk about it. But according to Jim, there really were no problems between John and his mother. He said John loved his mother and that he would never hurt her. And as for that fight that they got in over John going to school or not that morning, Jim said that was totally insignificant and not a reflection of John and Cindy's actual relationship. After speaking with Jim and a few other friends of John's that came out of the memorial service, investigators felt satisfied that John really was not involved, and so they crossed his name off the suspect list. So with no other new leads and no further information on any teenager running across the Borton's yard on the afternoon of the murder, investigators were now sure that the killer had to be Cindy's husband, Robert. So, about 1 week after the murder, investigators brought Robert into the interrogation room in the basement of the local police station, and then once he was sitting down, a special agent from the state's Division of Criminal Investigation leaned in close to Robert and said, "Bob, let's quit playing games. We both know Cindy was dead when you went back to work." But for the next 3 hours, Robert, who showed very little emotion and no signs of grief, refused to change his story. He said he had nothing to do with his wife's murder. He said that Cindy had seemed totally normal when he left for work early on the morning of the day she died, and when he came home for lunch that day at noon, she was alive. And she was also still alive when he left to go back to work at 12:45 p.m. Before leaving the police station, Robert agreed to have his fingerprints collected, and he agreed to take a lie detector test. So, the very next day, a special agent drove Robert 150 miles northeast to Des Moines, where Robert was hooked up to a polygraph machine that would measure his physical reactions to a series of key questions. Questions like, did you hurt your wife? Or, did you kill your wife? And Robert would answer these questions the same way he had the day before in the basement interrogation room at the police station. No, I didn't hurt my wife. No, I didn't kill my wife. But this time, the polygraph machine showed that Robert was not being truthful. He didn't fail his test by much, but the results convinced investigators that despite Robert's denials, he must be the killer. And so the agent who had administered the lie detector test pulled Robert aside for another round of intense questioning, telling him, hey, you failed this test, so you gotta tell us the truth now. But Robert continued to say that he had nothing to do with it, and he even fell asleep during this interrogation. Even with this failed lie detector test, the police lacked hard evidence that linked Robert to the murder. And so even though they wanted to keep him, they couldn't. They had to let him go. And so a special agent drove Robert back to Shenandoah, and on the drive, he turned to Robert and he said, "You know, Bob, when this is all over and you've been arrested, charged, tried, and convicted, I would be honored if you confessed to me." But a week later, 2.5 weeks after Cindy's murder, investigators got another piece of bad news when the state's crime lab reported that they had not been able to lift any fingerprints from the various murder weapons that had been found in Cindy's kitchen. They also were unable to pull any prints off of any other physical evidence that had been sent off for testing. As September inched towards October, and police had still not made any arrests, the residents of Shenandoah were outraged and scared. Every day they called the police station and the mayor's office seeking updates, and local gun stores reported a serious uptick in sales. And in November, Robert, who was being questioned by police nearly every day and was being shunned by residents who now walked across the street to avoid talking with him, he packed up the family's belongings and moved with John to the town of Gladbrook, just outside of Des Moines, where he and Cindy had actually gotten married. Around this time, local reporters began asking the question that was on everyone's mind. How was it possible that in a town as small as Shenandoah, police could not figure out who had committed such a heinous crime? And on top of having a murderer on the loose, Shenandoah also had an arsonist on the loose. Around the time Cindy was killed, someone had been intentionally setting fires around town, damaging an elementary school, as well as destroying a pickup truck. And while the arson attacks didn't appear to be connected to Cindy's murder, it did seem odd that there would be two violent crimes happening at the same time in a town that saw almost zero violent crime. And so some investigators began to suspect, just because of the rarity of violent crime, that the arson attacks and the murder had to be connected. And on November 30th of that year, their suspicions seemed to be confirmed. On that day, there was an arson attack at Shenandoah City Hall, except this time, the arsonist left behind a note. On this note, the arsonist warned police that the school fire and the truck fire and the murder of Cindy Borton were nothing compared to what was coming next. At the end of this note, the arsonist identified themselves as, quote, the Night Stalker. The Night Stalker was the name of a notorious murderer in California who had been captured 3 years earlier. But what really caught the attention of law enforcement was the fact that whoever had signed the note also left behind a fingerprint at the very bottom of the piece of paper the note was written on. While investigators waited on the results of the fingerprint analysis, they returned to the scenes of the earlier arson attacks, and on a bridge near the school fire, police had found the letters NS painted on a concrete support. They believed these had to be the initials of the Night Stalker. By early December, the mayor of Shenandoah had received more than 200 calls from terrified residents demanding that the police find the arsonist/killer before they murdered anyone else. But the Night Stalker lead came to an abrupt end a few weeks later when the fingerprint analysis not only failed to match Richard Borton's fingerprints, it didn't match any prints on file in any local, state, or federal law enforcement database. So unfortunately, both the arson cases and the murder case began to grow cold. It wasn't until 5 months after Cindy Borton's murder that local and state investigators would get the tip they needed to break the murder and arson cases wide open. Around dinner time on the cloudy, cool night of January 30th, 1989, the Shenandoah police chief, Richard Hunt, got a call from one of his officers. There was a teenager who had just walked into the police station, and he wanted to talk with someone about the murder of Cindy Borton. A few minutes later, Chief Hunt was sitting in his office looking across his desk at 18-year-old Jack Johnson, one of John Borton's best friends and classmates, and one of the boys investigators had talked with back in September when they were confirming John's alibi for the time of his mother's murder. Jack told Chief Hunt that a few days earlier, on January 26th, Jack had been talking to someone, and during their conversation, Jack had asked this person what was the worst thing they had ever done. And this person paused for a moment, and then they said to Jack, I've done something that I'm pretty sure God will never forgive me for. Jack would go on to tell police all the awful details of what this person claimed to have done that God would not forgive them for.
At Miro Test Lab, it takes more than cutting-edge product design to be the fastest trail-running shoe. It takes thousands of hours of testing by elite athletes who embrace the trail's unpredictability. Because same is boring. Learn more at MiroTestLab.com.
Based on Jack's testimony, this is a reconstruction of what really happened to Cindy Borden.
Last player standing.
Back on the day that Cindy died, September 6th, 1988, she and her husband Robert were sitting in the kitchen eating spaghetti and talking about their son's recent bad behavior. After Robert was done eating, he put his dirty dishes in the sink, he thanked his wife for the food, and then he headed out the door to go back to work.
I'm not tired.
As Cindy began washing the dishes, she heard a knock on the back door. Glancing at her watch, she saw it was already almost 1 p.m., which meant she didn't really have a lot of time to visit with whoever this was before she had to step away and get ready for her 2 p.m. shift at the donut shop. And so feeling a little bit flustered, Cindy turned off the faucet and she dried her hands, and then she walked around the counter and she walked down the very short hallway that led to the back door of the house. And as she walked down this hallway, she looked through the glass of the back door and she saw who her visitor was. And even though she was pressed for time, she couldn't help herself. She smiled. She was happy to see him. However, she was a little bit concerned that her visitor was not in school. But she opened the door, and as soon as the door was open, her visitor immediately reassured her that he understood he was supposed to be in school, he'd be there soon. He was just stopping by because he was hoping that Cindy wouldn't mind being a reference for a job that he was going to be applying for. And so Cindy said, yeah, of course I'll be a reference for your new job. I'd love to hear about your new job. Come inside, let's talk about it. And so her visitor stepped inside, and as they walked down the little hallway towards the kitchen, the visitor asked Cindy if it was okay if she got him a glass of water because he was thirsty. And so Cindy said, yeah, no problem. Come in the kitchen, I'll get you water, and we can talk about this new job. And so they start walking down this hallway, and the visitor reaches into his pocket, and he unfolds his pocket knife. And right as Cindy is stepping into the kitchen with her back to him, he walks up behind her, he reaches around the front of her neck, and he digs the blade into the front of her throat, cutting her neck wide open. Cindy instinctively reached up and tried to grab her neck to protect herself, but her attacker grabbed her hands, pulled them away, and then with the knife, he dug another trench across her throat. And then the attacker backed up a couple of steps. Cindy, who was now pouring blood out of her neck, stumbled forward into the kitchen, and then she whipped around, clutching her throat, looking at her attacker. It was 18-year-old Jim Bettis, her son's best friend. But she didn't have time to process who was attacking her, because before long, as she was staring at him, he lunged at her again, slashing and cutting her. And so she put her hands up over her face to protect herself, and was digging the knife over and over again into her forearms and her hands and all over her body. And eventually she kind of slumped onto the kitchen counter after being stabbed and cut so many times, at which point Jim walked away from her and he walked over to a drawer that he knew from all of the visits he had made to this household to visit with John. He knew that in this drawer were kitchen knives and other utensils. And so as Cindy is laying right near him up against the counter, pleading with him to stop, and she's bleeding everywhere, he reaches into this drawer and he pulls out two of Cindy's sharpest knives and he sets them on the counter, and then he pulls out two long serving forks that each had very pointed prongs at the end. And so he turns around to look at Cindy, and Cindy sees what he's doing, and so she tries to make a run for the phone to call 911. But before she could get there, Jim grabbed the two knives that he had just taken out of the drawer, and he leapt in front of Cindy and began stabbing her over and over and over again on her sides, her front, her face, her hands, her legs, anywhere he could, he would stab her. And Cindy the whole time is trying to hit him and push him back, but there's nothing she can do. She's helpless. And then at some point, she kind of falls to the ground, but she's not dead yet. And so at that point, Jim put down the two knives he had just taken out of that drawer, and he went back and he got the two serving forks. And then he went back over to Cindy, who was now crawling across the ground trying to get to the phone, and he began stabbing her in the back of the neck, on the side, over and over and over again. Despite multiple puncture wounds to her vital organs, Cindy was not dying. She was bleeding profusely. She was likely mortally wounded at this point, but she kept
trying to move forward. She kept trying to fight back. She was doing
Enemy
anything she
down.
could
My
to save
ultimate is ready.
herself.
Here.
But eventually, Jim overpowered her. He flipped her over onto her back. And then kneeling next to her, he got his tools lined up next to him, the 2 knives, his own knife, and the 2 serving forks. And systematically, he began using these tools to begin cutting and slashing and digging
Your
into the
duty is
front
not
of her
over.
torso. And he would continue to do that until Cindy finally stopped moving. And when she did stop moving, he picked up one of the serving forks, he raised it up over his head, and then he brought
One
it
enemy
straight down
remaining.
into her neck, plunging it deep inside of her. And then he let go of the handle, leaving the fork
Weapon
stuck
here.
into her neck.
Thanks, little man. Thrash
Then
is
he
ready.
wiped off the handle of that fork as well as the other handles of the other murder weapons, which he just left on the floor next to Cindy, with the exception of his folding knife. He would take that. Then Jim stood up and walked into the small bathroom near the kitchen, and he washed his hands and face, leaving faint traces of blood in the sink, but wiping his fingerprints from the faucet handles. Then Jim retraced his steps to the back door. He stepped outside and paused for just a minute before taking off at a run across the Bortons' yard. He would be seen by that neighbor, except the neighbor would only be able to describe him as a thin teenager with brown hair. 3 hours later, Jim and his parents would be out driving around when they passed John, who had just bolted from the scene and the news of his mother's death. Jim's parents slowed the car down, and Jim leaned out the window and he comforted his friend, asking him if he wanted to come into the car and talk about what happened. Did he need to ride anywhere? But John, who was in a state of shock, would just shake his head and keep on running. 5 months after killing his best friend's mother, Jim would confess his crime to his other best friend, Jack Johnson. Not only would Jim tell Jack exactly where he had disposed of his pocket knife,
Impossible.
he would also draw a diagram for Jack showing him exactly where Jim had left Cindy's body inside the Bortons' kitchen.
Reloading.
On the night of January 30th, which was the day that Jack Johnson had gone to police to tell them about Jim, he presented Jim's hand-drawn diagram and pushed it across the desk to Chief Hunt. On February 2nd, 1989, police asked Jim Bettis to come to the police station for an interview.
One enemy
Once inside the
remaining.
interrogation room, Jim denied everything, saying he had never had that conversation with Jack Johnson. But after agreeing to let police collect his fingerprints, police determined
yourselves.
Jim's prints
We
matched
fight
the
once
one
again.
found on the note left by the Night Stalker. After another round of questioning, Jim eventually admitted to being the arsonist, but it wasn't until he conclusively and massively failed his polygraph test that he would admit to police that, yes, he had killed Cindy Borton. It would turn out Jim had nothing against Cindy. The person he really hated was his own father. According to Jim, his father had spent years deriding and criticizing him. For a while, Jim had taken out his anger by setting fires around town, but for the last several months, he'd come to despise his father so much that all Jim could think about was killing him. But Jim was afraid of his father and couldn't really imagine himself besting his father in any kind of physical confrontation. And Jim wasn't even sure he could go through with killing anyone. So he decided what he needed to do
You will
was
not
practice.
kill my ally.
He needed to find someone who
Here.
would be easy to kill, someone vulnerable, someone who trusted him,
Enemy
someone
attack
who
is
loved him. And the one person who fit that
Spike
bill
down,
was his
C.
best friend's
One
mother,
enemy remaining.
Cindy Borton. As far back as Jim could remember, Cindy had been the one person he knew who was always glad to see him and who always had time to talk with him.
So you just keep
and
holding
who
the angle
always
so she's
offered
gonna
him
push.
encouragement. She would be the last person to suspect that he could ever hurt her. And so he told himself if he could kill Cindy, maybe he could also kill his father.
Just
The
give
police
me a
were
look.
able to finally prove their case against Jim when they found his pocket knife that he had tossed under a local bridge.
Match point.
The knife still had Cindy's blood on it, along with Jim's fingerprints. On November 13th, 1989, Jim Bettis, who was 19 years old at the time, was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. In a letter Jim wrote from prison, he told a relative that when he, quote, killed that lady, I guess I went too far and pretended that she was my dad. By 1990, 2 years after Cindy's murder, Robert and John had moved again, this time to Eldora, Iowa, a town of 3,000 residents located about 3.5 hours northeast of Shenandoah. Robert would remarry, and he would find work at a plastics recycling plant. State and local law enforcement in Shenandoah defended the intensive investigation techniques they used with Robert, saying that from the start, he was their only viable suspect. Now, 52 years old, Cindy's son John wants people to remember his mother for her life, not her death. He would tell reporters in April of 2022 that she was a wonderful, wonderful person, and I only miss her on days that end in the letter Y. You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music. Around 2 a.m. on April 6, 2018, a mysterious person walked down a snowy suburban street in Wadsworth, Ohio. At some point, this person came to a stop in front of a modest two-story home. At that point, the mystery person looked around to make sure no one was watching them, and then they turned away from the road and walked down the driveway toward the backyard of the property. What this person did next was unspeakably cruel, and it was caught on camera. This story includes graphic descriptions of violence as well as sexual content. As such, listener discretion is advised. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please invite the 5-star review button to come on over for a fun pizza party, but when they get there, only serve fermented herring. Also, please subscribe to the Mr. Ballin podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Margaret Douglas loved sitting out on the front porch of her neat gray house in Wadsworth, Ohio. Settled comfortably into one of the white wicker chairs that overlooked her 6-foot-high rhododendron bushes with their clusters of purple flowers, she knew all of her neighbors by name. And she also knew by heart the daily rhythms of this quiet street in a town of fewer than 2,400 residents. Wadsworth was one of those tiny middle American towns that you could find pictured on a postcard. And since Margaret and her husband had arrived in this town back in 1959, not much had changed. Now, in the early spring of 2018, Margaret was 98 years old, and the chilly April air was still keeping her inside. But even though Margaret lived alone these days, she had plenty of wonderful memories to keep her company, along with regular visits from a few close relatives and from a few of the neighbors who had become her good friends. Margaret had been born in 1919, just 1 year after World War I had come to a bloody close. By the time Margaret was just 25 years old, she had already lived through Prohibition, which was a 13-year-long ban on the production, sale, and consumption of alcohol in the United States, and she'd also lived through the Roaring '20s and the Age of Jazz, which was a period in the 1920s and the 1930s. On December 6, 1941, Margaret and her family had listened in shock to the first news reports about the Japanese attack on the U.S. naval fleet in Pearl Harbor that catapulted the United States into World War II.
30 seconds left.
And it was after World War II ended in 1945 that Margaret, at the age of 39, met and married her husband, Donald Douglas, a World War II U.S. Army veteran. For her whole life, Margaret had been a person who held firm opinions and wasn't afraid to share them with the world. And in her husband, Donald, Margaret had found the perfect match. Once they were married and settled into their 3-bedroom house in Wadsworth, together they bucked convention. Instead of having children, they centered their lives around each other, on travel, and on their careers. Margaret loved her job in nearby Akron, Ohio, where she worked at O'Neill's, which was one of the biggest and most glamorous department stores in the state. As for Donald, he proudly told people he worked at the Ohio Match Company, the world's largest producer of wooden and paper matches. And during the 41 years that the couple was married, they would live through the ups and downs of history together. The Civil Rights Movement, the first moonwalk, the Korean and Vietnam Wars, the hippie movement of the 1960s, the age of rock and roll, and the Gulf War in 1991. When Donald passed away in May of 2000 at the age of 80, Margaret, who would turn 81 that year, chose to carry on living the kind of life that she and Donald had enjoyed as a couple. Her first decision was to remain right where she was, living in the house at 359 Portage Street in Wadsworth that held so many happy memories for her and her late husband. She might not have Donald by her side anymore, but as her nephew Howard Leisure and his wife Cindy knew, Margaret had never been a quitter, and she'd always had this wonderful appetite for life. Over the next couple of decades, Margaret, who was now a widow, spent most of her time socializing with friends, or gardening, or reading books, or watching TV. And she also spent a lot of time watching from her front porch one procession after another of neighborhood kids growing from toddlers to teenagers. Even in 2018, when Margaret was 98 years old, she still kept busy and enjoyed good health. Despite spending more and more time inside of her home, she still cared very much about her physical appearance, she kept up with the news, and she still very much looked forward to her regularly scheduled appointments with her hairdresser. Margaret's philosophy on life was simple. The world changed, and so she needed to change right along with it. On the morning of Thursday, April 5th of 2018, Margaret woke up and made her way to the front door to collect her newspaper. When she opened the door, she saw gray clouds in the sky and felt the chilly spring air blow across her face. She could already tell she would not be spending any time outdoors that day. Her body just could not handle the cold anymore. So, after getting dressed and eating her breakfast, Margaret sat in her favorite armchair in the living room and read a book and also watched some TV. She made 2 more light meals for herself that day, taking her time after each one to wash and dry her dishes, and she also set aside a few bills and notices that she knew she would need to get to in the next couple of days. As it grew dark outside, Margaret climbed the steps to the second floor of her house and got herself ready for bed. After washing up and putting on her nightdress, she went back down the stairs and curled up on the couch to read a bit more of her book and catch a little more TV before going to sleep. A little while later, as snowflakes fell outside of her window, Margaret decided that she was so cozy right there in her warm living room that she would just sleep down there on her couch that night. After turning off the TV and setting her book on the table nearby, Margaret snuggled down into her pillow and closed her eyes. Before she actually fell asleep, it hadn't even crossed her mind to get up and go make sure the front and back doors of her house were locked. She had lived in that house for more than 70 years and had stopped locking the doors a long time ago. 3 days later, at 9 a.m. on Monday, April 9th, the Wadsworth Police Department got a call from Margaret's nephew, Howard Leisure, who lived in a town just outside of Wadsworth, about 40 minutes away. Howard told police that the day before, one of Margaret's neighbors had noticed newspapers were piling up against her front door, and when he, Howard, had tried calling her, she had not picked up. And considering her age, he was concerned about her. So police immediately sent a patrol officer to 359 Portage Street for a welfare check. When officers arrived at Margaret's house, they found the front door was unlocked, so they stepped inside the residence and called out for Margaret, but the house was silent. They began searching the property, but there was no sign of a disturbance, nor was there any sign of Margaret, except that her walker, which she took everywhere with her, was still neatly tucked behind a well-used armchair in the living room. Finally, after searching the whole house and finding nothing, the police called back to their station and filed a missing person report. Then, the police who had done the search contacted Howard and his wife to inform them of the situation and to ask them to come to Wadsworth to assist in the search for Margaret. While police waited for Howard and Cindy to arrive at the house, they spoke with some neighbors who had gathered outside, and they would tell the police that the last time they had actually physically seen Margaret was a few days earlier on Thursday, April 5th. By late afternoon, Howard and Cindy had arrived at Margaret's house, and after speaking with police, they quickly walked up the front stairs and into Margaret's home. Inside, the first thing that Howard noticed was that the small red wallet that his aunt always carried with her or left on the little table next to her favorite armchair was missing. And a few minutes later, Howard opened the small downstairs closet, thinking maybe Margaret had left the wallet inside of a coat pocket that was hung up inside of that closet. But instead of finding Margaret's clothes hung neatly on hangers like they would normally be, the closet was a jumble of clothes piled on top of his aunt's vacuum cleaner on the ground. Peeking out from the bottom of the pile, Howard spotted one of the slippers his aunt often wore. Stooping down, Howard reached out and he grabbed it. Seconds later, the police and Cindy would hear Howard let out a scream of pure horror. They ran from the living room and found Howard on the ground, recoiling in shock and pointing at the open closet in front of him. Within minutes, there were dozens of police and emergency vehicles outside of 359 Portage Street. As neighbors looked out their windows to see what was happening on an otherwise cold and quiet Monday evening, a patrol officer was already blocking off the perimeter of Margaret's property with bright yellow crime scene tape. Inside, other officers wearing gloves and crime scene gear were gathered around the open door of that tiny downstairs closet, while Howard sat in another room, his wife's arm wrapped around his shoulders while she tried to comfort him. When Howard had tugged on his aunt's slipper, he had felt a foot still inside of it. Moments later, police would discover Margaret's body, all but naked, crammed inside of this little closet underneath the pile of clothes. Her head, face down, was wedged into the back corner of the closet, while her backside was up in the air, her knees bent underneath her at a sharp angle. Margaret was deceased, and based on the condition of her body, it was obvious she had been the victim of a violent homicide.
One enemy
Within hours
remaining.
of discovering Margaret's body, investigators were combing Margaret's property looking for clues. And it wasn't long before they found their first important piece of physical evidence. It was a single food service type plastic glove with small traces of blood on it, and it looked like someone had recently dropped it in Margaret's backyard. But other than this glove, which was quickly sent off for testing, the police did not find anything else on the property that could help explain what had happened to Margaret or who was responsible for the attack. While patrol officers spread out around Margaret's neighborhood to talk with residents about any unusual activity or people in the area, detectives began considering possible motives for the crime. At first, it seemed like this had to be a robbery because Margaret's wallet was missing. But it would turn out that wallet was the only thing missing from Margaret's house, and it only contained a little bit of cash and some credit cards that had not even been used since Margaret was last spotted on Thursday, April 5th. So with robbery more or less ruled out, police began to wonder if, Margaret had enemies that might want her dead. But everyone the police spoke with said the same thing. Margaret got along with everyone. No one would want to hurt her. And so, with no obvious motive or suspect, the police simply began investigating everyone who was close to Margaret. They started with Howard and Cindy, but they were both quickly ruled out using their cell phone data. Police would also speak to other family members, friends, and they too would all be quickly ruled out as well. But when they started interviewing neighbors and former neighbors, one person stood out. His name was David Klinkenbach, and even after moving from the house next to Margaret's to a new address 2 miles away, David had continued to be the person who checked up on Margaret most frequently. He'd stop by her house a couple of times a week, and he helped take care of her weekly trash collection, moving her garbage containers to and from the street on trash day. Right after Margaret's body had been discovered, police had actually called David's home because they had been told he was close with her and so they wanted to speak to him, but he had not answered. Instead, police found him right outside of her house, pacing around, chain-smoking cigarettes, and telling anyone who would listen that he was very nervous about his fingerprints being all over the inside of Margaret's home. When police spoke to him, he obsessively asked them how was the investigation going so far and what had they discovered inside of the house. So, feeling very suspicious of David, the police would bring him into the station for questioning, and pretty much right away, David began looking more and more suspicious. David seemed to have information about details of Margaret's death that had not been widely shared, like where exactly in her house she had been found and what she was wearing. And when answering police questions about how well he knew Margaret, David also surprised investigators with random comments on Margaret's appearance and the fact that, especially earlier in her life, she had been a very attractive woman. But by the end of Wednesday, April 11th, so 2 days after the discovery of Margaret's body, David would be ruled out as a suspect. The DNA results from the bloody glove that had been found in Margaret's backyard had come back, and the blood on them did not belong to David, nor did it belong to anyone the police had spoken with thus far. Additionally, Margaret's autopsy had come back, and her time of death was listed as sometime around Friday, April 6th, and the data from David's cell phone showed he was not near her property at that time. So now, with the residents of Wadsworth starting to press law enforcement for answers, police were forced to regroup and take a different approach to finding out who, in this quiet, pretty town, would have wanted to kill a seemingly harmless 98-year-old woman. The only thing that seemed even remotely promising as another possible lead were reports from neighbors that in the weeks leading up to Margaret's death, there had been a rash of minor car break-ins.
What the
Nothing very
heck?
serious, just a few car owners who had told police that their unlocked
is
vehicles
that?
had been rifled
Don't
through
want-
and small items like change and
I
dollar
don't want
bills
to-
had been taken. But
Bro,
these crimes
I'm
of
clippy, man.
opportunity made police wonder if the perpetrator had started to check for unlocked homes as well as unlocked cars. Maybe they had tried Margaret's front door, they had found it open, and before long, what started as a robbery turned into a murder. And when police started looking right around Margaret's house to see if around the time she was killed, had there been any car break-ins or had there been any other recent reports of suspicious or possibly criminal activity, they found something. A carjacking had been reported right near Margaret's house on April 8th. So this would have been one day before Margaret's body was found. So the police tracked down the person who owned the vehicle that had been stolen. The owner was a 50-year-old church worker named Paul Shalin. Police expected this interview to be fairly simple and straightforward, but it wasn't.
better than him. He weird.
When police visited Paul at his house and asked him to describe what happened, he came across as very nervous and evasive. He told investigators that he had been out driving and had seen a young man, maybe 18 or 19 years old, and he apparently was limping as he was walking down the sidewalk. And so Paul, being a good Samaritan, had slowed down and asked this young man if he needed help.
One
and the young
enemy
man
remaining.
said yes, he did need help. So Paul said he had pulled his SUV over to the side of the curb and he had got out to help the injured young man.
Last player
But
standing.
as soon as
there
Paul
one's
had
one.
climbed out of his vehicle and had begun walking around the back of the vehicle to make his way over to the sidewalk, apparently this young man had lunged
What is
and
this
opened the passenger side door of Paul's SUV. He had leapt
Better than
across the
yours.
middle console into the driver's seat
What do you
and
mean
then
better
had
than- what
sped
do you
off,
mean?
leaving
How is
Paul
that-
stranded.
I meant.
However,
His
the
aim is
story
better than
didn't
yours.
really make sense to police because, according to the report,
one
Paul's
time,
car
it was
had
one
been
time.
found
Okay.
almost immediately and right down the street, totally undamaged. And after police wrapped up this first interview with Paul, they would review security footage of the carjacking that had been captured by cameras on a nearby building, and they saw firsthand that Paul's story was just not lining up. The footage of the carjacking showed that there was this young man on the sidewalk near where Paul's car slowed and
James,
stopped, but the young man was not limping. And as soon as Paul had stopped his car next to the curb, he didn't get out of the vehicle. Instead, the young man approached the passenger side of the vehicle and appeared to be speaking into the window, presumably to Paul. And then after a couple of minutes, the young man climbed into the vehicle with Paul. And then a few minutes later, Paul would suddenly jump out of the car, and the car, with the young man still inside of it, would take off down the road. So the police went back to Paul's house to question him again, and when confronted
One enemy
with the
remaining.
security footage of the carjacking, Paul would eventually tell police the truth.
Now at Firehouse
Unfortunate
Subs,
for
get a
me.
medium pepperoni pizza
One
meatball
enemy
subs for
remaining.
$6 when you order with the new Firehouse Subs app. With Italian meatballs and crispy pepperoni, it's part pizza, part sub, all good. Tap the banner now to start your order. Price and participation vary. Terms apply.
It would turn out the carjacking actually started as an encounter that Paul had set up using the social networking site Grindr that caters to people who identify as gay, bi, trans, and queer. According to Paul, he and the young man had met as planned and had begun a sexual encounter inside of Paul's SUV. But then, according to Paul, the young man, quote, snapped. And then a few moments later, the young man had overpowered Paul, forcing him out of the car onto the road.
Owen's
And then
actually
the young
cool.
man sped off, leaving Paul standing there in the middle of the street. And then when the car was recovered later that day down the road, the young man was not found. When asked by detectives to provide contact information for this young man slash carjacker, Paul would tell them that he was so embarrassed about what had happened that he had actually deleted all remnants of this young man from his phone. Meaning he had completely deleted his Grindr account and so could not recover it, and he also had deleted the contact information for this young man that he had stored directly on his phone. So, with no way of finding or identifying this carjacker, the police were forced to just wait and hope this mystery carjacker eventually turned up. A few days later, on Friday, April 13th, roughly 1 week after Margaret was killed, the Wadsworth police got a call from a local construction site reporting that someone had broken into one of their trailers. When investigators arrived at the scene of the break-in, the first thing they did was search the area. And behind the trailer that had been broken into was a cell phone lying in the dirt. The police would quickly unlock the phone and discover that its owner was a teenage boy whose name was already very familiar to Wadsworth police, Zach Thronson. Zach was a troubled young man who had previously gotten in trouble for petty theft as well as breaking into people's cars. And so naturally, the police thought Zach not only must have robbed this construction site, but almost certainly had to be the mystery carjacker they were looking for. And if that was true, maybe Zach had something to do with Margaret's murder. When police tracked Zach down, they found him asleep in his car in the parking lot at a local high school, and when they looked in the driver's window at him, police immediately noticed that his knees were all cut up, and these cuts looked recent. Waking up to see police tapping on his car window, Zach was nervous as well as startled, but he quickly agreed to come into the police station to answer a few questions.